Welcome to the We're All Dying podcast. On today's show, I talk with Dr. Amy Shea. She holds both a PhD and MFA in creative writing from the University of Glasgow, where she also wrote a collection of essays called Not All Deaths Are Created Equal. Amy is currently the program director for Mount Tamalpais College, a free community college for the incarcerated people of San Quentin Rehabilitation Center. Her work has appeared in numerous reviews and publications. Today we talk about her deeply impactful book, Too Poor to Die: The Hidden Realities of Dying in the Margins. Well, welcome Amy Shea to the We're All Dying podcast. I'm so excited to have you here.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
I was wondering if you might be able to share with us what it is you're working on today, some highlights in your career, to just let the listeners know where you're coming from before we dive into all this good stuff around your book that I am just so gobbling up right now.
No, I'm happy to do that. And thank you so much for asking. It's been a real trip with this book. And I think the really cool thing is, it didn't end. Things haven't ended with this book. In fact, I'm moving on already to the next project that I'm working on. The last two chapters in this book focus on medical respite units and hospice for unhoused people. And they were the hospice was the very last chapter I worked on. I literally had done it about a month after I signed the contract for the book. I said, "Can I do one more chapter?" And she said, "Yeah, go for it." Because I've been kind of wanting to look into that more. And well, that is now like become sort of part of my focus, I guess. And I'm working on a second book. And I have all this research lined up for this year that's going to take me to all these different hospice for unhoused across the country. So I'm going to be spending time. I'm in the Bay Area, and there's a hospice that just opened up in Sacramento. It's about an hour and a half from us. I'm going to be spending the summer once a week out there, researching and volunteering. I'm going to be in Salt Lake City back at the in-between, which I talk about extensively in the last chapter. And I'm probably gonna go to Madison, Wisconsin. Solace Friends is another hospice for unhoused there. And so I'm just really excited that this book has, I sort of started with the death care side of things, and then moved into the end of life care and looking at healthcare access in general. And so I'm really focusing on that for this next book. And in addition to all of that, part of what this next book will also have is a hospice for incarcerated people. And so my day job, I'm in prison education. I work for Mount Tamalpais College. We're a free community college for the incarcerated people of San Quentin. And I think, my time there, I've been there for 5 years. In addition to what I do, those two worlds are sort of colliding now. Because what happens to people who have life sentences or who become terminally ill while they're in prison? And so that's getting folded into this other book of looking at hospice for unhoused, because in a lot of ways, when you're incarcerated, you are homeless in some ways, and that the way your healthcare needs might be addressed and the way you might approach end of life care are going to be quite different from somebody who is, free and housed. So that's where I'm at right now. That being said, I haven't left the death care side of things behind. I just came back from New York. I was there for, I think I was in New York City for all of 24 hours, and I got to go to Hart Island, which for people who
Wow.
don't, yeah. So for people who don't know, Hart Island is the biggest and the oldest potter's field in the US, which is, it's essentially a county burial for people who can't afford private burial. There are over 1 million New Yorkers buried on Hart Island. And I went with Elsie Soto, who runs the Friends of Hart Island, and her father and her brother are both buried there. And so herself me and another woman, Emma Acker, who's also in the New York area doing lots of good work as a death doula, went and joined Elsie and went and got to spend a couple of hours on Hart Island, and it was absolutely amazing. So
Yeah.
I'm also like, I haven't left that behind. I'll be doing some more articles and some essays on all of that stuff as well. So yeah, I've been doing this work now for, I don't know, 15 plus years. I've lost track.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just a rabbit hole I went down and I haven't come back up, because every time I think about it, something else really interesting comes up. And there's just so many good people doing so much good work in this space. So
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely, one of those categories where you're never going to run out of things to learn or expose or try to communicate. And I'm really excited to talk to you because for me, the shift in these conversations was realizing that death is not equal, right? This idea that
Right.
we're all gonna die, yeah, but in our death, it's not the same. And privilege plays a lot into that, access to things, right? Our circumstances at the time. And the first kind of marginalized group I thought about was the unhoused, right? And I
Mhm.
had a conversation, I think, probably this time last year, with someone who was holding memorials for those who died unhoused, and just realizing, like what that means, like when you're unhoused and maybe your friends are dying or you're in fear of your own death. And there's all these like layers around death that those of us who have stable housing just don't have to think about. So yeah, I could talk to you forever, but I will try to keep us on track here. But I'm going to be following you until the end of your journey and mine. So
Oh, perfect.
yeah, you got a groupie in me.
Which doesn't seem like anytime soon. So
Yeah.
buckle up.
Yeah. Okay, so I do like to talk about a little bit of like your own personal experience with death as well, to kind of show people kind of how people like us end up in this space. Do you remember the first significant death in your life? Maybe it was a family pet or someone in your family or a friend. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I I had a couple grandparents who passed away when I was very young or younger. And so in some ways I would say, oh, maybe those influenced me. But like my grandfather died when I was 5. And so I barely remember it. But I do remember my dad telling me much later, he tried to take me up to the coffin. It was an open casket, tried to take me up there to see him, and the rest of the family wouldn't let him.
Okay.
So
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so I write about this actually in my master's thesis. I remember like having these like visions and thinking about death and then realizing what I was it took me to be an adult to realize what I had been imagining as a child was from Disney's Fantasia. Because I was so like sheltered
Yeah.
from it in so many ways. And then my dad's mother died and I was 9 then. So again, I mean I do remember that a bit more, and that was more memorable. But the most significant one, this is what really kind of partly led me down this path, was when I was 32, when my grandmother, my mom's mom, died. And I that was the first time that I had been like involved, like in a
Mm-hmm.
sense. Like, I had gone to the hospital the last time she fell, and that was actually, as that was sort of the beginning of the decline, right? She never went back home after that. But then I had moved to Scotland and she died while I was there. But during that time, my dad was sending all these emails and talking about her decline and telling me all these things. And then I did come home for that. And, but that was the first time I felt like included or involved in anything.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, that's really messed up, right? I mean, how privileged have I been that it took until my 30s to have a death impact me in a way? And I remember, I came back to Scotland and I was having grief streams, and I'm like, you're not allowed to do that. She's your grandmother. That's not your grief to have. Like, you're not supposed to, like, of course we knew she was going to die. She was in her 80s. This was not surprising. But there was just a lot of complicated feelings. And I remember also thinking about how we handled that as a family, and then like collectively and individually, how we were all managing this, and how little we talked about it even as it was happening. If it happened for my dad's incessant emails, which I included in my master's thesis because I like they were so detailed out to the family, down to the point of she's now eating with her hands and here's what she's doing. All these like
Yeah.
he literally like transcribed her decline as it was happening
Wow.
to keep
Wow.
us in the loop. Um, but yeah, so it was just, I think that combined with the work that my dad had been doing with the county cemeteries in Fresno, and kind of having this like moment of being like, okay, whoa. Also, my grandmother mostly got what she wanted, but we also didn't totally know what
Mm-hmm.
she wanted because we didn't talk about it. And then there's this whole other subsection of people who maybe don't have any choice or get any agency in terms of end of life care and death care.
Yeah.
I remember my grandmother died. alone. But she was left alone for 5 minutes. My dad walked around the corner back to his house to take a break. Nurse took a break, and in that moment, she died. And at that time, I remembered being really angry with the nurse
Yeah.
and thinking, you step it took a minute for for people people to talk to me realize like that's what happens sometimes. People sometimes just wait until there's no one in the room and they go. But
Yeah.
again, like I was like I think I was like projecting onto her and thinking, well, I wouldn't have wanted to be alone. But we didn't know what she wanted because again, we didn't talk about it. So
Mhm.
yeah, so much. So that was really that it was part of one of those big kind of moments that set me down this path.
Yeah.
And
It's so
also realizing I
interesting.
was sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it's so interesting talking about, the invitation to be involved, right? That invitation to be
Mhm.
involved. And, it brought up something for me thinking about my own grandmother's death and kind of being there for her. But yeah, it's sort of like you're kept away as a child, and then all of a sudden you're an adult. So the other adults assume you can be a part of it, but nobody's taught you. Like nobody's taught you about grief. Nobody talks about grief. And then you're sort of left with, well, what's appropriate? And is this mine? And yeah, it's like so fascinating. And I mean, that's part of the work is getting people to talk about this much
Mhm.
earlier so that when it happens, there's some preliminary work that you've done on yourself. But also I love that you touched on, the decision of choice around our death, right? The
Mhm.
agency to decide, do I want to die alone or with others? And I know there's going to be people listening who are thinking, why would anyone want to die alone, right? And through
Yeah.
your work and through conversations I've had, for some people that is what, a quote unquote good death or a preferred death would be is being alone in that final moment for whatever the reasons are. Um, Okay, so that's sort of like the evolution kind of coming into your adulthood. Do you want to talk a little bit about the work your dad was doing with, the documentation and how that kind of brought you in? Was that the moment that you kind of moved into death work, broadly, or what were you doing right before that?
Yeah, so my dad started the work he was doing. So he, in his retirement, ended up connecting with the Genealogy Society at the library in Fresno, where I grew up, which is in Central California. And he was helping them. They were mapping the cemeteries and that they were sort of literally trying to get all the records. He was going around to every cemetery and trying to get the records from them so they could digitize all this information. So if somebody came and said, I'm looking for a great 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 grandpa, they could say, oh, he's at Holy Cross Cemetery in this plot row, etc. And in doing that, they, the county coroner came to them and said, "We have this stack of boxes. It's all the records from people who've been buried in the county cemetery in Fresno, which is, again, the Potter's Field sometimes is how it's referred, but it's the county cemetery. And we don't know what we're going to do with these. We don't really have space for them. They did not have the resources to digitize them themselves. So my dad took those, and there's a online database now of all, I think it's over 11,000 people buried in those county cemeteries that is on the library's website that you can go and access now. And so that was like 2010. So it's about 2 years before my grandmother died. And I was in Boston at the time, and I would come home periodically, and my dad's telling me about the work, what he's doing, and I'm just like, what the heck is a potter's field?
Yeah.
You know, at that point, I would say I probably wasn't thinking a whole lot about death. I was just living my life as barely 30, I was like, la la la, this is great. And I wasn't thinking about death. I also wasn't thinking about how much it cost to be dead or to
Yes.
die. And so when I came home to visit, I said, "Can you take me?" And because he was talking about these power skills, I'm like, "Take me and show me this place." And I think that was the first time it really struck me because, and I talk about this in the book, but the time he had yet to, I think, connect with the right people or figure it out. It didn't seem like you could access the county cemetery. It did not look like a place that people belonged in. And there wasn't like a clear way to get in, etc. So he took me to the Catholic cemetery where I have great grandparents buried, which is adjacent to it. And we walked to the back of that cemetery and peered through the fence so he could show
Wow.
me
Yeah.
the county cemetery. And it was in that moment you're standing between these two places and one is incredibly stark. it was just a dirt field with weeds,
Yeah.
and on the other side is the Catholic cemetery. And Fresno, for people who don't know, is basically desert. It's hot and dry, but the Catholic cemetery was bright, luscious green grass,
Yeah.
beautiful trees, da da da. And so that was like that first like,
Yeah.
whoa.
That's so
And it
symbolic.
goes and it stuck with me. But I wouldn't say I didn't do anything right away. It wasn't until my grandmother died, and then I was in the middle. I had just started a master's in creative writing, and all those things came together. And it it wasn't until actually after I did, the MFA was 2 years. I wrote a series of kind of personal essays, vignettes, etc. And as people would read it and be like, this is really interesting, but like there's this darkness to it. I'm like, huh. And it wasn't until later I realized I had written so much about death in that master's thesis, and that had not been my intention. It just seeped in. And so what happened after I got out of that, I came back to Boston and I was just working and writing, and I found myself, I think when my grandmother died, it started like just looking or finding like
Mm.
texts and different things. But when I got back, I don't know what happened. I just started absorb like trying to gobble all of it up, everything and anything I could find. I was reading it, I was watching, you know, uh, like documentaries, I was listening to podcasts, whatever I could get my hands on. And so that's when I really, it was like 2016, I think, 2015, 2016, I was actively starting to write and work in this like death and dying space,
Yeah.
very intentionally at that point. So that's sort of when it really like all coalesced. Because I think like my writer's brain took all these things, it took them and it was all jumbled in there. They started like pulling on these threads and being like, oh, oh. And then I just like think part of it too was me also trying to navigate my own feelings around death and dying and mortality. Because, I had, like, as I mentioned, right, but talking about like my grandmother and thinking about that. But prior to that, I hadn't really addressed or dealt with it. And so it wasn't even just, oh, I'm doing this because it's an interesting thing to write about. I was really doing it for myself. And then part of my process to process things is to write. And so that's how it all kind of came together.
Yeah, I mean, I love this because it's continued to grow, like
Yeah.
since you've been uncovering things. The book, Too Poor to Die. Do you want to just share with people sort of like how expensive it is to die and sort of maybe some of the like uncommonly known costs associated with it? Like, I think we all know funerals are expensive, but I don't think we
Yeah.
recognize how expensive. And when you begin to look at that, you recognize, yeah, there's a lot of people who don't have that money accessible, especially right now, 2026. Yeah, can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I was just thinking about this. Funny. I'll read this little paragraph from the book. And I open the chapter. This chapter is called the Department of Transitional Assistance, which is the department in Massachusetts. Actually, it's part of what they do. They're like the social services, human services department at the state. So they deal with all kinds of things. But one of those is when somebody can't afford to bury their loved one or whatever. And it's interesting. They will offer, I think at least the last I know, and I don't know if it's changed, but the last I knew it was about $2,500 they would give to, a burial or cremation, with the stipulation that it couldn't be more. It could be more than like $1,500 or something. It's like
Mm,
basically whatever their requirement was almost impossible to meet
yeah,
because even information is more than $1,500. So if you go over that, then they're like, well, you don't need our help. We're not going to give you any money.
right. Hmm.
And so actually what happens in Massachusetts a lot of times is funeral homes do it sort of pro bono.
Yeah.
And they eat the cost, even though it's incredibly expensive because
Wow.
no one can afford, they can't keep the cost down low enough to get the help.
Yeah.
Um, but anyway, so that's one place. It's done very differently all over the country. But I'll read this little section that just I do this to list out because I want people to start thinking about all those like nickel and dime type things. That's how it starts to add up. So the National Funeral Directors Association notes that the median cost for a burial is around $8,000, and a cremation with a service and viewing is more than 6,000.
Wow.
According to their website, the average non-declinable basic service fee is $2,100. So that's just your baseline. Then there are the optional cost averages, including the removal of the body to the funeral home, $395, embalming, $845, other body preparation, $200, use of facilities staff for a viewing, $425, hearse, $350, service van car, $150, basic printed memorial package, $180, metal casket, $2,400, urn, $295, a cremation casket, $1,300. And and I just put that in there, and I know those numbers will change over time. But the point is like it starts to really stack up. And people don't necessarily think about the fact that in some states you can't transport the body yourself, and so you have to pay for that. Or you can, but there's certain requirements around that. And that they're just all these little kind of different fees that pop up for all these things that people aren't necessarily prepared for. So again, when you think, oh, they're going to give you $2,500, that barely would even cover the baseline. And the baseline that they're knowing is the average would be more than what would be allowed in Massachusetts anyway. And so yeah, and even in Fresno, for instance, is another example when the county handles it. So again, if you can't afford to do it yourself, the county will step in and do it. And they get sort of a what do you call it, like a what's the word, bulk rate for lack of a better term. And they'll contract with a crematorium. And so it's about $250 roughly.
Hmm.
But in California, there's no public assistance for funerals. So if you want your loved one's cremains after the county has done it, you still have to pay that $250.
Wow.
And for some people, that's not possible, especially if it happens suddenly or unexpectedly.
Yeah. And I want to say, like, this isn't to say, funeral homes shouldn't get what things cost because these are services
Totally,
and these are people. But the
totally.
reality is it's going to cost something.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, I just want to say, like, we're highlighting the fact that it's expensive to die.
Yeah.
Um, and so, do you want to speak a little bit to, you know, the before, like the before people get to this point?
Mm.
Because I know you've done a lot of work with the unhoused, working with shelters and things like that. Do you want to just highlight sort of how people find themselves in this position where they can't pay for
Mhm.
themselves to die? Um, and then also, if you've come across anything around, the reflections or the experience or the harms even to those who are are like in the space of those who have died, who have been, and I know this word isn't the greatest word, but like unclaimed, right? That's kind of a word
Uh,
that we've been using. There's maybe not a better one yet. But yeah, just like sort of like the circle of influence that happens before someone who's unhoused or marginalized dies, and then the people around them, whether that
mhm.
is, they don't have any next of kin or friends or family, the workers, things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll try not to ramble here. Um,
Ramble away.
okay. Um, Yeah, I think I'll speak specifically, I think, to people who experience homelessness or who are unhoused, who come to the end of their lives. But that being said, funeral poverty doesn't just exist for folks in that circumstance, right? You
Right.
could be housed and still not be able to afford to
Yes.
bury mom or your brother or your sister or your husband or whoever it is. And I think what's difficult around there is that they're almost in some ways probably falling into the gaps more so because like for instance they're less visible in a sense, right? It's like you don't think about people who, well, you have a house or you have an apartment or whatever, um and yet people in those circumstances sometimes will find themselves unable to pay for burial and cremation. And I mean the good news is that there if you can't pay for it yourself, there is always an option, and that's generally through the county. Some states like Massachusetts, it's done on a statewide. I think Rhode Island might be similar. But there is an option. And I always say there's nothing shameful about having the county care for you or your loved one in death. What's shameful is I suppose it gets to that point in the first place. And then unfortunately, the reality of that is these places are under-resourced, underfunded, overworked folks. They're doing their best, but it's not always the the most dignified or what you might have chosen.
Right.
And I think what I always think about around all of this is, hey, there's nothing wrong with being buried on her island. In fact, it was beautiful. I mean, we were talking about that. We're like, would more than happy to be buried here. But if it's having a choice to say that versus you're just that's what happens because you have absolutely no voice in what happens to you or your loved one. And that's where things to me get sticky. And it's interesting with Hart Island, for instance, people couldn't even visit before like 2015, 2016. So
Oh,
there
wow.
was actually a real stigma attached to that, in that you knew if you ended up out there, no one was coming to visit you.
Wow.
And you knew if you lost your loved one, you weren't going out there to visit them. Uh, so there's it's not a perfect practice, but there is an option available. But that being said, one of the things I always say is I'm like, people, so if you're talking particularly about unhoused folks, and not everyone who's unhoused necessarily ends up with a county burial, right? There may be family or loved ones that can come in the end and claim them, and they're not in that space. But when you talk about indigent, meaning, having no money, no resources, etc., of course, like if you can't afford to have a house, how are you going to afford to be buried?
Yeah.
Um, I always say you don't end up there in a vacuum. You don't just suddenly like one day, poof, I'm in a potter's field and like, how did that happen?
Yeah.
There's a trajectory of things that happen along the way. And I think for people who are chronically unhoused, the real difficulty is there's no real access to a continuity of care, to having quality health care. And I think I would often argue that some folks in that situation don't trust the healthcare system because they're
Absolutely.
not
Yeah.
necessarily treated with dignity or again given kind of choice, etc. And so and that's why I write about in the book. I kind of, I talk about all the death care stuff, but at some point I was like, again, right, you don't just end up there. What's happening beforehand?
Mm-hmm.
Even at end of life care, I talk about having like hospice for unhoused people. Prior to that, having just regular health care in general makes a big difference. And I have a chapter in the book called Sweet Feet, where I volunteer at a foot care clinic. No one there was actively dying, right? But the point was, I'm like, when you are chronically unhoused, or
Mm-hmm.
in health for any length of time, trying to even keep, take care of something as simple as keeping your feet clean, keeping
Yeah.
your feet free of blisters, etc., can become a real difficulty. And if that's hard, imagine trying to manage diabetes
Yeah.
or heart disease or cancer or
Mm-hmm.
whatever else it might be. It becomes extremely difficult. And the reality is, people who are chronically unhoused die about 20 years on average younger than
Mm.
people who are housed. So it's in their 50s. But
Wow.
they're dying, like, yes, you have the subset of people who die of overdose, etc., right? That is part of it. But
Mm-hmm.
people in their 40s and 50s are getting diseases and dying from diseases that people in their 70s and 80s get. And
Right.
it's because when you can't manage something like COPD or diabetes, it gets out of control and it can kill you much more quickly.
Yeah.
Um, and I was sitting in a National Healthcare for the Homeless Council, like a webinar, and they were talking about geriatric syndromes,
Mm.
which are things like you start having trouble walking or something like incontinence. And it's
Yeah.
something that happens to many people when they
Yeah.
get to a certain age. But the nurse was talking about incontinence in particular, and it really struck me because even at this point, my book is already out. I've done all this research, and I'm like, well, there's still stuff that I'm like, oh my God, hadn't thought about. But she was talking about incontinence, and she was like, look, there are people in their 50s dealing with this because when you're chronically unhoused
Yeah.
and you don't have reliable access to a toilet,
Yeah.
you start to do damage.
Yeah.
And suddenly you're incontinent and you're 50 too. And what people don't think about with incontinence is not just, you're not able to control when you urinate, but also that leads to skin infections,
Yeah.
which can, if they don't get treated, can lead to sepsis,
Yeah.
UTIs, which can also lead to all the,
Yeah.
so it's like this thing that is like, it feels like for most of us, you're like, oh, I'm just like it's embarrassing. We joke about it, like, oh, I
Yeah.
have to wear a diaper or something like that, becomes this very serious, very real thing in
Yeah.
that situation. And so that's why I talk about like there's this long like trajectory of
Mm.
just injustice and lack of access sometimes to the treatments you need. You know, you end up in the ER getting treated instead of going to a primary care and
Yeah.
having a regular check-in, getting the medications you need, getting the PT you need, whatever it might be. Um, and so in that situation, yeah, you end up potentially dying much younger. And so there are these hospice for unhoused that do pop up, that have popped up around the country, but they are few and far between, and they
Mm.
struggle. There's one in Denver, Rocky Mountain Refuge, and I'm not sure right now they might be closed. Last I talked to them last month, they were possibly closing temporary or hopefully temporarily because of
Hmm.
lack of funding while they tried to raise more funds. And this isn't the first time they've done that. And they only have 3 or 4 beds, but they have a constant wait list because it's the
Yeah.
only one in the whole state.
Wow.
And the one in Madison I mentioned earlier, there's only 3 or 4 beds in that one for
Yeah.
the whole state.
Yeah.
The one in Sacramento for California, 16 beds. The only one for the whole state.
And also, Amy, like you might not live near that. So like even if your name gets up the list and you're
Yeah.
still alive, right? You might not be alive, then now you've been taken out of your community, right? So if you did have people who would visit you, how can they visit you, right?
And I would argue, right, like it makes sense that you have one in Denver and you have one in Madison. Those are the
Yeah.
most populous cities in those states, and they're probably where people, the most in-house people are. That's
Yeah.
not the case for I mean, Sacramento, yes, but like, what about LA? Like, and you're right, and you're not even going to end up there, and that's
Yeah.
just not going to happen. So what happens then if you get to that state and you are on the streets?
Yeah.
So there's all of that. And then
Wow.
and it's really interesting when I was doing the research for the book and I was talking to one, Circle the City, they're in Phoenix. They're actually a medical respite unit, but they have a couple of beds that they set aside if someone needs hospice. And I remembered asking while I was there, it's like, so what happens if someone dies here and there's no next of kin or no family that's willing or able to claim them?
Yeah.
What happens? They're like, oh, I know, the coroner comes and picks them up, and then it's their problem essentially.
Hmm.
And it is likely what happens is
Yeah.
the coroner picks them up, tries to find next of kin, and if they can't, they go into wherever their particular burial situation is
Yeah.
for county. Uh, so yeah, but I will say what you meant, I think your other question was like talking about the people in those spaces. But
Yeah.
there are really people doing so much good work, and again, like. Yeah, it sucks if you end up in a county burial if that's not what you wanted. But at the same
Hmm.
time, there are people trying to do right.
Yeah.
Like when I talk to one county in Napa, they'll if they get very few people. I mean, it's like maybe 3 or 4 a year, if that. And not even unhoused, but just people who can't afford burial, or they can't find next of kin. But if they can track down, for instance, like a burial plot that your family has and their space, they will do everything they can to get you there versus putting you in the county cemetery.
Right.
Um, in Fresno, they have stopped burying there. They now send the cremated remains up here to the Bay Area and they go out to sea.
Okay.
Um, which is, anyway, I won't go into that right now, but I do know there's only, to my knowledge, one boat that goes out and does this.
Hmm.
And no one can go out with him because he takes them all with him, but my understanding is he sings or he plays music before he dumps them in. And it's like there's all the kind of bummer aspect of like your family can't be there, even if they wanted to, they couldn't go out, et cetera, this or that. But at least there's someone doing something.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you know about the book Ashes to Admin by Evie King.
No.
It's UK based, but
Okay.
she's a count what they call a council funeral officer. So it's the same thing as in the United States when it's the county or the public.
Hmm.
And she will, so this is most of the time what she's dealing with are, elderly people who no longer have any next of kin left or they've become estranged, et cetera. So this person, they need to do a burial. She will do everything in her power to find people. If she can't, they will hold a service. If they find, I
Hmm.
think she writes in the book about one man, they found a coworker who came and played guitar.
Yeah.
And whatever she can do, she'll make that effort. And so I think that is what people, I had an agent when I was shopping the book around go, oh, homelessness and death. Ugh. Like those are both real bummers. I was like, no one's gonna want to read that. And I'm like, okay, challenge accepted.
Yeah,
But at the same time, I was like, sure, yes, the reality is these things suck. But
yeah,
at the same time, I've met so many people who are
yeah.
just doing what they can, stepping into this space and trying to create dignity or trying to offer choice or options or care or
Mhm.
whatever it might be. And there's something that to me that's really beautiful.
Yeah, it allows us, I think, a space to be helpful, to be kind, to be caring, to not really have to do much, right? Like some of these acts can be, just as simple as like holding someone's hand or just listening to them tell their story. And I think that, humans are looking for meaning making. We're looking to be a part of something. And I think once we get over that, death, it's so like morbid and creepy. It's so beautiful to be with people in the final act of their life, if they're
Yeah.
if they're open to that, right? Or even if they
Yeah.
don't know you're there, but they've died and you've done something so generous as to have a funeral for them or, sing a song to them out to sea. I think these moments are, they change you, right?
hmm Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, and I think, you think about like NODA, the No One Dies Alone program, and at
Yeah.
the in between in Salt Lake City, which is they have a hospice for unhoused there. They have volunteers who will do that, and they will sit and hold someone's hand if that's what they want. And so when they do like intake with folks, and while they're there, they ask them, "What do you want? Do you want music played? Do you want us there? Do you want to be alone?" And I think about that. I think also I met this woman in Napa, and she's trying to get her choir together. So when they do a burial for someone who's unclaimed, the choir can come and sing. So there's again, it's like it's something really small. And I've had people ask, like, what do we do? I'm like, this is what you do. You look into your community and you see where there's a need. Is there a county cemetery where you could just go and place flowers once a month,
Yeah.
or get in touch with the people, or find a way to get in touch with people who are holding the burials and say, hey, can we come and be a witness? It doesn't have to be this big, visible thing. It could just be used. I think for all of these things the way a lot of the gaps get filled are just with community members showing up.
So beautiful. In some of those intakes or, when talking to
Mm.
people as they're coming into hospice, are there some surprising answers or maybe some common answers that you've heard around what's important to people who maybe have had a different lived experience kind of ending up at, and like, ironically, they've been unhoused and now they have shelter at the end of their life, which is wonderful.
Mhm.
What are some things that you've found interesting in terms of what's important to
Yeah,
them?
it's funny. I think what I've noticed in the people I've spoken with and spending time in some of these places is like you just said, right? They maybe have been unhoused for a very long time and suddenly they have this beautiful space. Like I walked into the in-between and went, hey, like, can I come here to die, please? It's so nice. And
Yeah.
everyone's so amazing. And I think that a lot of what people say is how they're suddenly treated. Like they're
Yeah.
treated like such humans, and they value the nurses and the volunteers and all the staff who like they I was actually in one case at the in between, I think some of the caseworkers were going out and buying like treats and things with their own money for people, or like they wanted like some special candies or whatever,
Yeah.
and the people were like, I think, almost shocked or like really like full of gratitude for these people going out and spending their own money to bring in these things to help
Yeah.
them, to bring them comfort. Um, and even with I talk about in the book, Richard at Circle the City, and he was talking to the nurses and said, "I love to sew." They did it. They found him a sewing machine.
I love
So
it.
the last few months of his life, he was able to sew while he was there. And but on the flip side, they had told me a story about one young man who um, was dying, and they had to send him out. Sometimes, unfortunately, in some of these places, they have to send them out to the hospital to do certain things. They can't manage them there. And they wanted to give him some extra treatment, and he was like screaming, like, "No, you're going to kill me! You're trying to kill me!" And I
Oh,
think that because there's a level of, again, this like huge level of distrust from
absolutely.
what he'd experienced up until that point.
Yeah.
Um, So I think, yeah, that there's sort of there's a lot of things happening there. But I've heard stories. There was one woman who died at the in between, and they were talking about how before, I think it was like before she died, everyone came out and everyone took chalk and they all drew and like drew pictures for her, and and this was all the other residents coming together and doing this. And so I think that is one of the things you see in some of these places too, especially some of the places where there's more people. There's this sense of community that starts to happen in those spaces as well for folks. And they had that on the streets, of course, but to have that in a safe space. And the other thing actually that people have mentioned that was surprising is that, like, I was talking to the folks at Joshua's house, and they've only been open a year, and they were sort of anticipating that they were going to have folks who were just didn't have family come and weren't going and the total opposite has happened for some people because they're now in a safe space that's accessible, that's safe for the family to come to as well. They're coming and they're visiting and they're spending and they're reconnecting with them because they're in this space where they can do that, safely and comfortably. And then I think they were surprised, but like obviously joyfully surprised that that's become sort of a reality for folks there.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know the lived experience, but like I can imagine there's so much like regret that's different maybe from those
Mm,
of us who have had stable housing. Just thinking about, yeah, this you've just described this opportunity where now the family feels safe to come visit. And
mm,
all the years that might have been lost in between
mm,
those visits and all those moments. And now it's, 6 months are left before this person that matters to them is dying. And
mm.
yeah, I'm just wondering if there's anything that you can speak to that we might not understand or know or have witnessed, that kind of happens in those final moments, that speaks to regret that might be different than, the list that we always hear, like wish I didn't work as much, like wish.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are there some other ones that kind of come up for people?
Yeah, I don't know if regret is something I've seen or heard a lot of, but what is interesting is that a lot of folks who are unhoused, who end up in these spaces, do so because they're estranged from family. Like that was just, such a common theme. But what's been really interesting to see is again, once they're in those places, the staff will ask, like, do you have family that do you want to try and get in touch with them? And I think for some, the level of things that have happened or the estrangements is too much and they're not interested and they
Yeah.
respect that. But for a lot of folks, I think they do want that. And then, there was one man at the in between, and he had an apartment. He wasn't unhoused, but I guess you could call him housing unstable, essentially. He
Yeah.
ended up in the hospital, found out he had terminal illness, and that he needed more assistance than what he wasn't gonna be able to get that on. He couldn't live on his own anymore. But
Right.
he didn't have an option. I think he probably, if I'm gonna, I don't remember, I don't know if he told me how old he was, but my guess he was probably younger than 65 then because, Medicare and all that hadn't kicked in. So anyway, and even then, I don't know if you get in-home care with Medicare. I can
Yeah.
imagine it's still too expensive. But he came there and he had said he had two adult sons, but he had lost touch with them after he got divorced because the wife took the kids, and basically like that relationship was severed. But during that time in there, they were able to get both sons. One was calling him every week. And I suppose there was a sense of regret. He was so desperate to talk to his dad as much as he could
Yeah.
because he's missed out on so many years of having him in his life. And I think both of them were able to make it up there before he died and spend time with him. And there's actually a really good short I'll have to send you. It's a half an hour. It was done by Nine News out of Denver, and they show it's about Rocky Mountain Refuge. But they show this one woman who'd been an alcoholic most of her life, and she again wasn't terribly old, but was on hospice there, dying from liver failure, I think. But her family was able to come, and her son's wife was pregnant at the time. And
Oh.
they show her like rubbing this belly because she was probably gonna die before that baby was born.
Oh.
And you could just, I think she even talks about like that loss of having that family connection up until that point. But at the same time, like, wow, it's amazing that they were able to do that, that some people have had the opportunity to reconnect. But yeah, same as you, I don't have lived experience, but I can imagine
Yeah.
a lifetime of not having them in your lives. But then I guess at the same time, you're like, well, it's really beautiful, and there's a lot of great things that are happening that they are able to be together in that moment,
Yeah.
even if it is toward the end.
You're a writer, so I'm sure that you might be able to speak to this. But I mean, you've done a lot of research. You have a lot of like firsthand stories, talking to people. How like if people are listening, and maybe it's about a topic like this or something
Mhm,
else in the world of death and loss, or just injustice.
mhm,
How do we find our own way to speak about this if we haven't had the
mhm,
experience? Like, can you kind of
mhm.
speak to that? Because, I get very passionate about this stuff, and I often wonder, like, am I the one who should talk about this, write about this?
Sure.
Do you have
Sure.
anything? Yeah.
Yeah, I wrote a whole chapter about it in the book. And, I call it the anxiety of positionality, right? Because I was
Yeah.
thinking about myself sort of like a researcher or a journalist, like what's my position to this? I've never been unhoused. I'm, a white woman, middle-aged. We all have great intentions.
Yep.
What that old saying, right? The road to hell is paved with good intentions. And one of the things, so I think I'm really grateful that I wrote and did all this research for this draft of this book, or the first draft of this book, with a university. So I did my doctorate in creative writing. I was with the University of Glasgow when I wrote it all, because it gave me space to think through some of these things, including
Mhm.
when I had to go through ethics approval to go and interview people. So now I'm working on the second book. No one, I mean, I'm freewheeling, I'm independent, where I could do whatever I wanted. That being said, like I'm really grateful for having had that experience because they did, it slows you down and
Yeah.
it makes you think a little bit. And I had a lot of anxiety about being who I was, and as you say, talking and writing
Yeah.
about this experience of something I haven't had. So I've never been homeless, and I'm not dying yet. But and I didn't always know how to navigate that. And I would say that there were times when it really blocked me. And there were a couple moments where I was like, well, I'm just going to write this. It's going to be a doctoral dissertation. It's going to go into the library at the University of
Mhm.
Glasgow. It's never going to see the light of day. And to some extent, that was what helped me get through it because I was
Yeah.
like, at some point, I don't have to let this out in the world if I get really uncomfortable with that. But through the ethics, they had some of the things that came up, and it was really good to hear this, was even when you have really good intentions as a researcher and you want to go out there and do these things, you can still do harm.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think for me, a lot of the anxiety often came, particularly too, when I was in these spaces. I was like, I don't want to like co-opt someone's time, especially someone who's dying.
Yeah.
Um, for my own purposes and needs, and I didn't want to feel really selfish in what I was doing. And so I was always really careful. And I think part of that was going through staff first and saying, here's who I am, here's what I'm doing, be very transparent about all of that. And then they can be the go-between initially to see if anyone wants to talk to me. And even then I was like, there's this voice in my head going, but what if they say yes because they care about the staff so much that they don't want to displease them,
Mhm.
you know? And to some extent, you have to accept you can't control all of it. And that also, I think part of it was like, the way I think about the work I do daily in the prison is I'm like, they're adults.
Yeah.
And they're not, and this is the thing. They were what people I speak to are in spaces, they're sober, right? So if they hadn't been before, they are now. They're in a safe place and they're being cared for. And so I'm not just walking up to them on the streets
Yeah.
and not knowing what their mental state might be at that time or what they're going through. So, right, it's and in that safe space, they can simply say like, I don't want to engage with you, and they don't have to. And so I've taken that forward, and every time I go somewhere now, I'm like, okay, here's all the stuff I like with Joshua's house. I'm like, here's a flyer, put this out, give this to everyone, let them know what it is I'm doing. And everywhere and anything I've written down, I state, you do not have to talk to me. And you can start talking to me and then say, I don't want to talk to you anymore.
Yeah.
But I really want always like thinking about like being really mindful and respectful of people's time and where they feel safe. I don't want to like, and if they ever feel like uncomfortable or unsafe, I'm out, you know?
Yeah.
And then I think in addition to that, and I talk about this in the book some, part of what helped me get through all this anxiety and address this was looking to other artists and writers
Mm,
who've done similar things and thinking about how you get there. So I didn't come up with this on my own. I stole this from all the other people who've already done this before me, but I realized in reading their works and listening to them talk that I guess as a writer, with my platform being this, this big, very tiny, but still having something of a platform,
yeah.
uh, that I feel an obligation to use part or all of that towards speaking against or toward about the things I care about. And that just because I'm talking, as long as my voice isn't silencing someone else's,
Yeah.
that there's room for all of us to share and to talk. And part of, as I understand, being who I am, I can speak to people similar to me who haven't had these experiences, and I become sort of a conduit.
Yeah. I
And so
love
then like, thinking about that from the perspective of being an artist and a writer and wanting to do something beyond, like something that I can advocate for.
Yeah. What are you hoping your work changes in the world?
Initially I just was like, I just want people to read it and take that information and process and whatever that means for you. But I've talked to people and people have already done things. I mean, the woman in Napa who's bringing the choir together, that came about because we started talking, and then she did some more research and found out they do it in Sonoma, so now she wants to do it. And I was like, oh my gosh, like even if I play a small part in that. And I met this student down in LA, and she's working on a project on death and dying. And she came up to Fresno, which is like a 3, 4 hour drive for her, up to see me speak. And then we met, and she was telling me stories. She's like, after I read your book, she's like, you talk about the socks and Sweet Feet. She's like, I've started carrying socks in my car. And she's like, and then I found this woman that I pass all the time on the way to work. And she's like, I've kind of got involved with her and I'm trying to figure out how to get her into a shelter. And I was like, whoa, like even just carrying the socks in your car. I was
Yeah.
like, that's awesome. That would have made my day. And so I think it's those little takeaways, like when someone thinks, oh, maybe I can just smile at people I see on the streets, or oh, maybe I can donate to one of these shelters, or go volunteer somewhere. I think it's like I want there to be a call to action, but it doesn't have to be, again, it doesn't have to be big. It
Yeah.
really can just be, or if it's nothing else, but like talking and thinking a little bit about this and telling someone, hey, have you heard of county cemeteries? Have you heard of Potter's
Yeah.
Fields? Like spread the word. And I think like all these little things, this is how we build something and how we, like I said, fill those gaps. And so I'd be happy. I was happy with people just reading it, but even just hearing people talk about some of the stuff they've done has been really cool.
I love that. I cannot believe it's almost been an hour.
Oh my God. Sorry. I
So
know.
it's-
Probably.
we're gonna have to have you on for part two for your next book because I'm really interested in, the lived experiences of dying incarcerated and
Mhm.
even just those layers of, being on those aren't their homes, right? They've been
Right.
stripped of their homes. But um, any advice for the living? So this can be like anything, like in your journey of, coming to terms with your own mortality
Mhm.
or somewhere along the way. What advice do you have for those of us who are still alive here today?
I mean, for me, it's like I think and write a lot about death, but I think at the same time, I'm like, well, I'm doing that, but I'm like, well, next weekend I'm gonna go try and go up a mountain 15 times. And, like do these, so I'm like, for me, it's like I spend a lot of time here, but I think if nothing else, it's made me have even more FOMO. I'm like, I just want to get out and do everything.
Yeah.
And I think that is it. Like, you still have to live, you still have to do all the cool things because I do keep thinking, I'm like, that could get taken away at any moment. And, I was doing the hospice training, and they're like, this thing where you like pull out cards and all the different things you have to give up over time is, and you're like,
Wow.
okay, yeah. So before I have to give that stuff up, I'm gonna like try and do it to the max. And
Yeah.
then I tell people, I said, that, in terms of if you're in spending a lot of time in this space, I think we all have our different ways of managing and processing. And for me, it is writing. And it's not all writing that goes out in the world, but just putting it on the page gets it out of my head
Yeah.
and allows me to go on and do the whatever crazy things I want to do while I'm alive. But And
I
then
love
of course, plan. And if I can, I'll plug Becky Robison's book. I don't know if it's called My Parents Are Dead, What Now?
Yeah.
And it's so great. And what I loved about that book was I'm like, my parents have already very much like planned everything. I don't have to worry about. I was like, but this is great for me and
Yeah.
advice for me. And it breaks it down in such a way where I was like, oh yeah, that's something easy I could do so that it makes everything easier later on. So yeah, in addition to it all, plan as much as possible now.
I love that. Thank you so much, Amy. I'm so grateful for all the work you've done. It's inspired me. There's like I can't wait to like Google like what is around me that I don't know because I honestly didn't even know that there was hospice specifically for those who are unhoused. I don't think there's probably anything in the city I live in, but
Yeah.
there should be. So now I'm gonna start, texting friends and being like, "Hey, you want to start this?"
Yeah.
So
Hey, that's what Omega homes are.
yeah, beautiful. Okay, thank you so
Yeah.
much, and we'll stay in touch as time goes on.
Thank you so much, Jen. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for listening to this conversation today with Dr. Amy Shea. If there was something in our conversation with each other that moved you, that spoke to you, that feels really important for others to know, please let me know. You can leave a comment on the episode or just send me an email. If there's a topic around death, grief, loss, especially as it relates to injustices, please reach out, let me know if there's an author, someone that I can interview to talk about this to make us all more aware. I would love to bring that to the community.